Welcome back. You're watching Political Exchange, and we are, of course, discussing the potential for a new 100 billion rand arms acquisition. Andrew, before the break, we were talking about the fact that much of the information is already in the public domain. Sector players are obviously involved. They know what is going on. We know that from the last arms deal, a lot of what we got to learn was as a consequence of bidders that didn't quite make it. And there was a lot of sour grapes. People like Richard Young and others were in the mix, and of course when they didn't get it, they blew the whistle on the process. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is that the potential for people to lose out again is obviously big, and what I'm trying to get at is to what extent ought we to pay attention to people who are part of the process, who perhaps don't manage to win contracts. To what extent are we supposed to take, their word for it if irregularities, do occur? How do you make sure that you're not chasing your own tail in instances like this?
I think this is a difficult one to manage because, I mean, obviously there will be able to access internal information, preferential thing, like they'll have tender documents, that kind of thing. But it's hard to say. I think I'm in some ways looking at what they have to offer. It could be useful, it could be limited depending on what occurs. I think it's something that we might actually just have to wait and see what occurs there.
Now, you focus on defence issues, of course. I mean, what is your assessment so far of the work that the Seriti Commission has, begun with? Some people are saying that it's going to be a cover-up. It's not really going to go down to the detail. If you look at the terms of reference of the Seriti Commission, it's incredibly broad and it's incredibly comprehensive. We know that former President Thabo Mbeki and members of his cabinet, including the finance minister at the time, Trevor Manuel, are among those who will be called to give evidence. People like the former defence minister Mosiuoa Lekota and of course former intelligence minister Ronnie Kasrils. Is the Seriti Commission going to be able to get to the bone of the matter? Are they going to be able to cut where they need to?
Again, it's hard to say. I mean, there's so many players involved, and there's foreign companies. I mean, there's a lot of international participation in this, whether we can have access to things that are maybe required. It's quite a tough one to call. I mean, I think there is potential for it to sort of be misdirected in a manner, but again, not something that you can necessarily put your finger on now.
If one looks at commissions such as the Seriti Commission in the international arena, we know, for example, in Britain, the British government just shut down the investigation into BAE, particularly the connection with the Saudis, citing issues of national security. I mean, are arms deals inherently corrupt given the nature of the sector in which we work? I mean, many people argue that weapons companies, manufacturers build into their margins what is called surcharges, which is just a code for bribes. As someone who watched the industry and the sector very closely, is it cliched but true to say that arms deals are inherently corrupt?
I suppose in a way it is. I mean, there is huge potential for corruption, specifically due to like the secrecy aspect of it, that it is often, and I mean, often the players involved, some of the biggest defense companies in the world who are closely tied to huge, powerful governments, they do have vested interests in winning contracts, keeping domestic industry alive. It is in some ways a problem. I mean, it's been quite widely documented in Andrew Feinstein's book.
Yes.
He looked at it extensively, and he has a huge litany of charges against multiple companies.
Now, I mean, the military-industrial complex globally feeds off the idea that weaponry is constantly needed, that you need to upgrade. And of course, this feeds this idea that countries are at risk and countries need to be prepared, and it feeds this war-mongering mentality. South Africa is not at war with anyone, but increasingly we are called upon to perform functions on the African continent. Apart from the fact that we need to acquire new trucks, ambulances and so on, is there a legitimate case for a new acquisition, given the fact that we're not at war, given the fact that what we do has to do with peacekeeping rather than waging war or ending, a conflict?
I would say most definitely there is a huge case, because at the moment, in some ways, the levels of equipment and the levels of force preparedness that we have we can't actually execute the Defence Forces function. To safeguard South Africa and to protect our interests internationally, we may not actually be able to do that because we don't have the equipment to do it.
But this is interesting because my understanding of the first defence review was that it came against the background of South Africa traditionally under apartheid being an aggressor on the continent, that it attacked what was then known as the frontline states, and that the way in which the defence review was designed was that it disabled South Africa from actually attacking and from being the aggressor. We didn't acquire, for example, planes that could fly from, let's say, here to Cairo, for example, with that particular aim in mind. Do you think that that was politically naive?
It's not necessarily. I mean, there is no real need to return to the pre-1994 military-industrial levels that we were. The self-sufficiency and the aggressive capabilities, they're not 100% required, but we still, I mean, the Defence Forces role is shifting quite substantially.
Absolutely.
At the moment.
I mean, for example, the battle against piracy. I mean, that is a huge threat. I mean, there you have organised syndicates operating. South Africa, I think with Egypt, are the only two African countries, I think, with submarine capability, if I'm not mistaken. So we get to police not just our coastline, but the entire coastline of the continent in situations where you have syndicates like pirates. So, I mean, is there not a case to be made then for us having that kind of capability? There
is in a lot of ways. I mean, you can do the piracy thing a lot with surface vessels and with aircraft, which in some ways are much cheaper than maritime, like frigates and so on. But you
can't do the kind of intelligence that the sub can do, isn't it?
In some ways, I think a sub is wasteful expenditure. We don't need that. The offensive capabilities of a submarine, no one in Africa typically faces the threats that require a submarine. But I mean, there's things like the Defence Forces being put into more and more roles that, although framed was sort of within a peaceful box or a peaceful sort of scenario, as peacekeeping or even more aggressively in intervention, like in the DRC at the moment. We're sending forces to MONUSCO. Our troops are going to be facing hardened rebels who in frontline combat situations.
And we're not armed, we're not capable.
We are to a degree, but this is the thing, is that we need new equipment, we need new stuff, because the stuff we have, the levels of force we can project in order to protect our troops are not sufficient.
Now, we're speaking here about a ballpark figure of 100 billion, but of course we know that there's hidden costs. I mean, initially in 1999, what were we talking about? 29 billion rand, and of course the eventual bill was what, 60 billion. So what is the figure that we're looking at, given the fact that 100 billion could easily escalate to what, 600 billion?
Yeah, it could increase substantially, especially, I mean, I think also in some ways this might be focused priority projects, because if you look at the entire, basically the Arms Corps shopping list across the Air Force, the Navy and the Army, I mean, we're looking at Project Aorta to replace our main battle tank, the Olifant. We were looking at Leopard 2s. That could easily bump up the price. We need saucepans, looking maritime surveillance aircraft. If we start factoring these things, we need heavy lift capabilities to get into peacekeeping ops in Africa. We have we have basically no air defense. We require substantial investment in air defense, or ground-based air defense. If we start packing all of these projects up together, the entire basket of requirements, we could massively exceed 100 billion. So I think in some ways 100 billion is conservative and it's focused and targeted. It's more immediate requirements.
Give us a ballpark figure. How much can this balloon buy?
It's hard to say. It could easily double.
Okay. Now, of course, we know that the defence budget is very meagre, that the South African priorities have shifted. We've got stubborn, massive unemployment, particularly youth unemployment. We've got inequality. We've got poverty. How do you justify the kind of money that we're talking about here against the backdrop of such social, need? I mean, we're going to an election next year. I can't imagine the South African public saying that it's okay to spend in excess of 100 billion rand on, acquiring weapons.
I think it's the way it's framed, in terms of it's more of a replacement necessarily than buying new weapon systems. Also, yeah, it's immediate. There's a serious degree of urgency here, but in terms of justifying it to the public, I think it's protecting our troops, and I think there's a lot less of a scope for international players to become involved, and then we have things like offsets. In some cases, offsets were running to a multiplier. Multipliers were a big component of offsets. They'd run to maybe 80 times.
When we talk about offsets, there was in the initial deal this promise of, you know, job creation, for example, but we saw that many of the projections were in fact just thumbsucks. We didn't see the kind of uptake in terms of jobs. What are the kind of economic, you know, knock-on effects that could deal with things like job creation in this acquisition?
I think specifically if the offsets are retooled, and the Secretary of Defence has mentioned recently that they are moving it towards this, at looking at keeping the expenditure within the local defence industry, which has a huge export potential and can be quite a significant employer, but also to allow more local participation, and especially for things like Hoefyster and Vistula, it's a lot of things that it doesn't necessarily have huge technical components that South African industry can't handle.
Right.
There's a lot of sort of nuts and bolts, bread and butter mechanical components that can be made here. So for instance, Hoefyster, which is just out now, 8 billion over 10 years, 70% of their contract value is going to be executed by the South African defence industry.
Right.
So that's jobs at home.
Yeah.
DCD has just spent huge amounts of money building a factory in Isando to produce armoured vehicles, mine protected vehicles.
So if the state, for example, were to package this as a job driver, as an industry that can, you know, spark uptake in terms of labour, which is what we require, do you think that that would kind of soften the sell, which, you know, is effectively going to be able to appeal to people around things that they require?
I think it could go some way to helping, but I mean, because the initial arms deal went so badly wrong, and because the expenditure was so essentially wasteful that a lot of the things that we purchased we really did not need, I think it's still going to be a difficult job. It's not going to be